I thank you, Mr. Ruffin. You have interviewed me. I kind of lost track of the number of times you interviewed me out at Juneteenth many a time. And I just want to note that you were the first person to document the African American Curriculum Center at Campus West um, just before I retired, when it was, I consider it to be a mini museum. You were the first person to do that. And thanks to you, I have a copy of that so that people can look at it. So I really appreciated you doing that interview there. But I'm here today to talk about the first Buffalonian to settle in Buffalo. And his name was Joseph Hodge. He was known as Black Joe. He lived with the Seneca uh, Indians for a long time. He married a Seneca woman. He could speak the language of the Seneca fluently. And he was very, very helpful and instrumental to the white settlers who came to this area um, before Buffalo was incorporated into the city. Buffalo was incorporated into a city in 1832. And I just want to point out my very first book, just a small book, it's only about 20 pages, but it took me 6 months to write it. And I usually, when I introduce the book to my students, way back when I was teaching first and second grade at the Campus West School, which is on the campus of Buffalo State, they would ask me a question. They say, well, the book is only 20 pages, Ms. Doyle. Why did it take you 6 months? Because of the research. And it actually, this book is 39 years old. And we just got through celebrating the Juneteenth Festival. And as a vendor at Juneteenth for more than 25 years, I always had this book on my table. People always look forward to seeing it. It always sold out. I think I have about 5 or 6 copies left. And the book is significant because it gave a little bit of history about Buffalo's Black community. And in those days, I was really just starting to do research. And one of the first people that I learned about, who I did not know about, was Joseph Hodge. As a matter of fact, his he's on the first page, and it's a very simple way that I did it here. And says we're going to learn about Buffalo's Black community. And then I talked about the streets on Jefferson, and then I talked about the first Black man to come to Buffalo. And I would read this book to like second graders. And it said, let's read about the first Black man to come to Buffalo. He came many years ago. He was called Black Joe. His real name was Joseph Hodge. He was a trader, and he understood and could speak the language of the Seneca. He was one of the first settlers to live in this area back in the late 1700s. Now, since I wrote this book, like I said, it's 39 years old. I've learned a little bit more about Joseph Hodge that I didn't know at the time. I always tell people I've been a historian and I've been writing the column Eye on History, which currently appears in the Criterion newspaper, the oldest Black newspaper in Western New York. It started in the Challenger, now 1979. The column Eye on History is 44 years old. And every time I write a new article, I learned more information after doing the research for so many years. And as I was looking up some information about Joseph Hodge, I ran across some very good articles. And one of the articles was actually from the Encyclopedia of Cleveland History, which is this museum is located in Cleveland, Ohio, and they had a nice section in there about Joseph Hodge. Also, as I said, known as Black Joe, he was a hunter, he was a trapper. He was hired in 1796 by the surveying party of Moses Cleveland. That I didn't know when I wrote the book, just really kind of getting this information. But he was hired by Moses Cleveland to guide a group from Buffalo across the Pennsylvania border into the Western Reserve. And he was the first Black to have contact with Cleveland. And, uh, and, and even though there are several articles that you could look up about Joseph Hodge, each one of those articles will really say the same thing, that not much is really known about him. So people have tried to piece together bits and pieces of information. Some historians speculated that perhaps he was a runaway slave, um, escaping from a farm in the Hudson Valley, where many slaves were in around in New York until slavery was prohibited in 1799. He was also, some thought, captured by the Seneca Indians in a raid during the Revolutionary War. And I thought that was interesting as well. And he lived with them for some time before being returned to, I think it was Fort Stanwix in December 1784. During captivity, he became very fluent in the Seneca language. He later became a trader and a storekeeper near an Indian settlement close to Buffalo Creek at that time. He also married a Seneca woman and was reported to have had a son, which I also just found out his son was reportedly killed in the War of 1812. And speaking of the War of 1812, I've done many lectures on that because a lot of people are not aware of the fact that there were many uh, blacks who fought in the War of 1812, especially with Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry and the Battle of Lake Erie. And I also referenced that into this little book. And I didn't, like I said, I only had a page or two, but I talked about the black sailors who fought in the War of 1812. And I didn't realize that one of the sons of Joseph Hodge was also killed in that war. Now, Joseph Hodge, as I said, he was a guide. He was an interpreter for the Moses Cleveland's surveying party from about June 1796 uh, until the end of July 4th, 1796. And so he was very, very helpful. Now, you would find this information in the Encyclopedia of Cleveland History, uh, which is located in Cleveland, Ohio, and that particular society was established in 1826. I found another very interesting article by an author who I have met before. He's a very talented author. His name is Steve Seashon, and he's written a lot, and I used to talk to him a lot. And he wrote a very interesting article, and the name of that article was Joseph Hodge, possibly the first Buffalonian and Buffalo's first bartender, which I found to be very interesting. Now, his article was actually written last February, and it was updated in 2020 when I looked it up. And he talked about him being called Black Joe as well. He also talked about the fact that he was thought to be an escaped slave, and then he ended up living with the Seneca people and marrying a Seneca woman. Many of the early trappers and the white settlers and the traders and the explorers who traveled through western New York credited Joseph Hodge in their journal. So that's how we've been able to find out some information about him. And they were very impressed with his ability to be able to speak the language of the Senecas. And he was important. They cited him as being a very important person to help them understand the customs and the culture of the Seneca people. And and this is a problem that many historians like myself have run into whenever we're doing research. The European historians often view African people in a negative light. Not all of them, but some of them do, and they pass that on into their literature. So many of them, the first Europeans, sort of dismissed the Senecas as being savages, not civilized, and like I said, coming from the European perspective, and they also dismissed Joseph Hodge. And I think that's one of the reasons we don't have a lot of information about him. And they didn't, when they referred to him, they didn't really call him by name. They just called him as being that Negro. So that's one of the things as historians and scholars we have had to overcome when we're writing about the history of African Americans. When the village of Buffalo began to grow and later was incorporated as a city in 1832, people began to write more about the history of the entire city. And according to this history, there was just a handful of people here, and they did cite Joseph Hodge as being one of those people. Now, according to some accounts, Joseph Hodge uh, had an Indian store. He traded with the Europeans who came and the things that they needed, the supplies that they needed. And one of the things that they were always looking for was not just the food, but they wanted to have a drink. That was a part of that. And there was a brewery, a historian who is a brewery historian about Buffalo. He emphasized the fact about Joseph Hodge and he used the word bartender, actually being the first bartender in the city of Buffalo. And when you think about Buffalo, if we don't have, we have a lot of bars, and all you have to do is go downtown Buffalo, and every time at least every time I look in the paper and look at the news, a new bar is being, set up, and breweries, people are opening these companies. So he gave Joseph Hodge credit as being the first person to make this popular. And so this is why I think we need to recognize him. He has not been really recognized. I'm going to talk about in a couple minutes the fact that there is a historical marker in his honor, and I didn't know that either when it was, but this was recent, so I would have known that when I wrote this book back in 1982. So I think it's important that in Western New York that we recognize him. It's important that our young people, when they're studying the history of Western New York, that they're introduced to the first person to settle here, the first black man to settle in this area. Um, I know when I was teaching, I think one of the reasons I was encouraged to write this book, um, Buffalo was celebrating its history during that time. This was many years ago in 1982. And so I wanted to read a book to my students about the contributions of African Americans in Western New York. So I went to the school library, there was no book. I went to the public library, there was no book. So I came home and I shared that information with my late husband, and he was the one who was encouraged me to write. And I said, I've never written a book before. He said, I'm sure you can. You're always lecturing and talking and doing things. He said, you can do it. So that same evening, I sat down at my dining room table with about 10 sheets of plain white typing paper, and I just started to write. And then as I was writing, I realized I didn't have the information. And I taught at the Campus West School, which is on the campus of Buffalo State. And when I got off work after teaching, I would go across the street. At that time, it was called the Buffalo and Erie County Historical Society. Today it's called the Buffalo History Museum. But that's where I started to do the research. Now, they didn't have a book either. What they had all of these files, and they would just give me a bunch of files, and I had to go through all these old articles. I started to piece together this information about Black Joe and some other things. And I know you want to ask me some more questions. I just want to end with this. Um, Joseph Hodge's home was described as being along the Little Buffalo Creek, which later became the Hamburg Canal. And this is where he built his home. And I found out something interesting too, because where his home was located is now covered by the I-190 and overpass between the Explorer and Moore Ralph C. Wilson Jr. Children's Museum. It was in that area, and I was very surprised to get that. As I was doing this research, I kept saying to myself, we need to have a historical marker, a monument or something in honor of Joseph Hodge. And lo and behold, I found out that there is a historical marker of Joseph Hodge in Sunset Bay, which is about 45 minutes south of Buffalo, not too far from Erie. And there's a beautiful marker there. Those who are listening to this or watching this, you might want to look up that. And so there's a marker there giving him credit as being the first settler in the Western New York area. But I'm hoping that at some point we will get one somewhere in Buffalo, maybe near the canal side, someplace downtown, recognizing him, and especially since all of these, we have these breweries and so forth, to pay honor to him from what he did in making contributions to Western New York. So that's Joseph Hodge, and I'm still learning, folks. There's still more information to come.